The mud on her hem cost more than her life's wages. He stood there, smelling of expensive bergamot and inherited arrogance, stating quite plainly that she wasn't enough. He expected tears, a trembling lip. Instead, she laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. Then, she turned her back on a dukedom. The library of Rothsay Manor always smelled of yellowed paper, slow-burning beeswax, and damp wool. Constance hated it. It was a heavy, suffocating smell that settled in the back of the throat and stayed there long after she walked the 3 miles back to the village. It was a Tuesday. The heat of late August pressed against the tall, leaded glass windows, trapping the stale air inside. Constance was bent over the heavy oak desk, her fingers stained black with iron gall ink, transferring the estate's chaotic ledger entries into clean, neat columns. Her neck ached. A single bead of sweat rolled down her spine, soaking into the cheap, stiff cotton of her collar. The heavy double doors didn't creak when he opened them. They never did. The hinges were oiled twice a week by a footman whose sole job seemed to be ensuring the Duke of Rothsay never had to hear the friction of his own existence. Gideon walked in. He smelled, as always, aggressively clean. Bergamot, starch, and leather. He didn't look at her right away. He walked to the window, the heel of his polished boots clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the parquet floor. Constance kept her head down. The scratching of her nib against the paper sounded impossibly loud. "Ow. You missed a discrepancy in the tenant accounts for the lower farms," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smoothed out by expensive tutors and a lifetime of never having to repeat himself. "I haven't reached the lower farms yet, Your Grace." Constance didn't look up. She dipped her pen. The inkwell clinked softly. Gideon turned. She could feel his eyes on the top of her head. He had pale, gray eyes that always looked a little bored, a little tired. He stepped closer. The smell of his cologne grew stronger, masking the musty odor of the old books. "I've made a decision regarding your continued employment, Constance." He rarely used her Christian name. It made her stomach give a sudden, unpleasant lurch. She carefully placed the pen down and wiped her stained fingers on a rag hidden in the folds of her skirt. Only then did she look up. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her collar, where the sweat had dampened the fabric, or perhaps at the frayed edge of her sleeve. His jaw was set. "You are a capable worker," Gideon began, folding his hands behind his back. "But your presence here has become complicated. The staff talks. My mother has noticed a certain familiarity." Constance stared at him. Familiarity. 2 weeks ago, he had trapped her against the bookshelves in the east wing, his hands gripping her waist so tightly it bruised, his mouth bruising hers. He had tasted of expensive brandy and desperation. She had let him. She had wanted him to. "I am marrying Lady Josephine next month," he said. The words dropped into the quiet room like stones into a dry well. "It is expected. It is proper." Constance felt a cold, dull weight settle in her chest. She didn't speak. She waited. There was a sickening anticipation in her throat, a metallic taste like old copper coins. "I will, of course, provide you with a generous severance," Gideon continued, his voice taking on a practiced, diplomatic cadence, enough to secure a modest position elsewhere, perhaps in London, farther north even. He paused, finally meeting her eyes. "You must understand, Constance, I am fond of you. More than fond. But you are, well, you are a clerk, the daughter of a disgraced solicitor. You are beneath me in every way that matters to the world I inhabit. I cannot have my wife dealing with whispers of a muddy-booted mistress." He waited. He had positioned himself perfectly, chin up, shoulders back, the reluctant but pragmatic lord making the difficult but necessary choice. He expected her to cry. He had a handkerchief ready in his breast pocket. He expected her to plead, to remind him of the library, the stables, the breathless whispers in the dark. Constance felt the blood rushing in her ears. A bizarre sensation clawed up her throat. It wasn't sorrow. It wasn't even anger. It was a profound, nauseating sense of absurdity. She looked at this man, really looked at him. The pristine white cravat tied perfectly at his throat, the immaculate cut of his coat. He looked like a porcelain doll, a hollow, expensive thing terrified of a smudge. A sound broke out of her, a sharp, ugly bark of a laugh. Gideon flinched. The mask of aristocratic regret cracked. I fail to see the humor. Don't you? Constance laughed again. It scraped her throat. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself, her shoulders shaking. You are terrified. You are absolutely terrified of me. Don't be ridiculous, he snapped, his voice rising a fraction. A flush crept up his neck, staining the pristine white collar. Constance stopped laughing. The silence rushed back in, thicker than before. She looked at her ink-stained fingers, then at his clean, manicured hands. Keep your severance, she said. Her voice was flat, dead. The humor had vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only a hollow exhaustion. I wouldn't take a penny from a coward. Constance. She didn't let him finish. She turned, her cheap cotton skirt catching on the edge of the heavy desk, tearing slightly with a quiet rip. She didn't stop to examine it. She walked to the heavy double doors, grabbed the brass handle. It was cold and slick and pulled. She didn't look back. She walked down the long carpeted hallway, the thick wool deadening her footsteps. She heard him call her name once. She kept walking, out the front doors, down the sweeping stone steps, and into the blistering August heat. The walk back to the village was brutal. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the dirt road into a hard, cracked crust. Dust coated Constance's boots, turning the worn black leather a powdery gray. Her torn skirt flapped against her ankle. By the time she reached her lodgings above the apothecary, her skin felt tight and salted with dried sweat. The air in the stairwell smelled strongly of dried valerian root and damp rot. Mrs. Hughes, her landlady, was sweeping the landing. She paused, leaning heavily on her broom, her eyes scanning Constance's disheveled state. Home early. Fired? Resigned, Constance corrected, pushing past her. Same difference when the rent's due, the older woman grunted, resuming her sweeping. The bristles scratched loudly against the wooden floorboards. Constance unlocked her door, the rusty key fighting her every turn. Inside, the room was an oven. She stripped off her damp bodice, the cheap cotton peeling away from her skin like wet paper. She poured lukewarm water from a cracked pitcher into a wash basin and splashed her face. The water smelled faintly of rust. She stood there, dripping, staring at the peeling floral wallpaper. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving behind a deep, aching fatigue. She had no job. She had 3 shillings in her coin purse. She had a torn skirt and a ruined reputation in a town that relied entirely on the Duke's estate for its economy. She pressed her wet hands over her eyes. She wanted to cry. The physical pressure behind her eyes was immense, a dull throbbing that demanded release, but the tears wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Gideon's flushed face. She saw the absolute panic in his gray eyes when she laughed. Her stomach growled, loud and hollow in the quiet room. She dropped her hands, picked up a towel that felt like sandpaper, and dried her face. There was half a loaf of stale bread in the cupboard. She broke off a piece, the crust snapping loudly, and began to chew. It tasted like ash. 5 miles away, Gideon was sitting at the head of a mahogany dining table that could seat 30 people. Tonight, it seated only 4. His mother, Lady Josephine, Josephine's father, and himself. The dining room was a cavern of wealth. Silver gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier. The air was heavy with the smell of roasted lamb, mint jelly, and expensive wine. The floral arrangements for the chapel are quite finalized. Lady Josephine was saying. Her voice was high, breathy, and perfectly modulated. She was a beautiful girl. Pale skin, blonde hair curled precisely, a gown of pale blue silk that whispered when she breathed. White roses, primarily. Mother insists on lilies, but I find them so funereal. Don't you agree, Gideon? Gideon looked at her. He blinked. Lilies. Yes, quite. His mother frowned at him from the opposite end of the table. Are you unwell, Gideon? You haven't touched your lamb. I am fine, Mother, he said, picking up his heavy silver fork. He cut a piece of the meat. It was cooked perfectly, tender and pink in the middle. He put it in his mouth and chewed. It took a supreme effort to swallow. He couldn't get the sound out of his head, that harsh, scraping laugh. He had expected her to be devastated. He had planned for it. He had rehearsed his speech in the mirror that morning, practicing the exact tone of regretful authority. He knew Constance. He knew she was proud, but he also knew she was poor. He had offered her a fortune, relatively speaking. He had offered her security, and she had laughed at him. He reached for his wine glass. The stem was cold against his fingers. He took a long drink, hoping the heavy red wine would wash away the dry, metallic taste in his mouth. We must consider the guest list for the reception, Josephine's father boomed, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. The Prime Minister has sent his regrets, but the Chancellor is confirmed. Gideon nodded mechanically. He looked at Josephine's delicate, unblemished hands resting on the table. They had never touched ink. They had never scrubbed a floor or mended a torn hem. They were soft, decorative things. He closed his eyes for a second. The memory of Constance's hands gripping his lapels in the dark of the library hit him with a sudden, violent force. Rough fingers, calluses on her thumb from the pen, the smell of cheap soap and warm skin. He opened his eyes. The chandelier light was too bright. It gave him a headache. Excuse me, Gideon said, pushing his chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the floor. I have a sudden, pressing matter of estate business to attend to. My apologies. He didn't wait for their replies. He walked out of the dining room, his boots clicking on the marble floor of the foyer. He bypassed his study and went straight to the library. He opened the heavy double doors. The room was dark, save for the moonlight spilling through the tall windows. The smell of beeswax and old paper hung in the air. He walked over to the desk where she had been sitting. Her pen was still there, lying exactly where she had dropped it. A small, black stain of ink had bloomed on the wood beneath the nib. He touched the stain. The ink was dry. He rubbed his fingertips together, feeling the slight grit of the dried liquid. She had called him a coward. He stood in the dark, the silence of the massive house pressing in on him. For the first time in his 28 years, Gideon Cavendish, the Duke of Rothsay, felt incredibly, pathetically small. And the worst part was, he knew she was right. The city of York smelled of sulfur, damp brick, and crowded humanity. Constance had been there for 3 weeks, and her lungs still hadn't adjusted to the thick, yellow smog that hung over the narrow streets. She worked in a printer's shop on a street, so narrow, the sun only touched the cobblestones for 20 minutes at noon. Her new employer, Mr. Finch, was a man who communicated entirely in grunts and sharp raps of his cane against the typesetting tables. Constance didn't mind him. He didn't care about her lineage, her torn hems, or the fact that she was a woman, so long as she could read a manuscript and set the lead type backward without making a mistake. Her hands were no longer stained with the elegant, watery black of iron gall ink. They were coated in printer's grease, a thick, tacky substance that smelled intensely of linseed oil and lampblack. It got under her fingernails. It settled into the fine lines of her knuckles. No matter how hard she scrubbed with harsh lye soap at the end of the day, a gray shadow remained on her skin. It was honest dirt. She preferred it. She lived in a room no larger than a closet, directly above a noisy tavern. At night, the sound of drunken arguments and shattering glass rattled her thin window panes. She would lie on her narrow cot, the mattress stuffed with lumpy horsehair, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. She didn't cry for Gideon. She was too angry and too tired to cry. But she thought of him. She hated that she did. She would be eating a bruised apple for supper, the skin tough and bitter, and she would suddenly remember the exact texture of his hair under her fingers. She would hear a carriage roll by in the street below, and her chest would tighten, expecting the sharp, rhythmic click of his polished boots. It was a phantom limb, an ache for something that had been severed. She ruthlessly pushed the memories down, focusing instead on the dull throb in her lower back and the cold draft seeping through the floorboards. Survival left very little room for romance. 300 miles south, Rothsay Manor was suffocating under the weight of an impending wedding. The estate was crawling with florists, caterers, and minor nobility who had arrived early to gossip and drink Gideon's cellar dry. The smell of beeswax had been entirely masked by the overwhelming, cloying scent of hothouse flowers. Gideon stood in the center of his dressing room. His arms were raised stiffly at his sides. A tailor knelt at his feet, his mouth full of pins, making minute adjustments to the hem of a dark navy wedding coat. "Breathe in, Your Grace," the tailor mumbled around the metal pins. Gideon tried. His lungs hit a wall. The fine wool of the coat felt like an iron cage. The high, starched collar dug into the underside of his jaw. He was sweating, a cold, clammy moisture that made his skin crawl. Lady Josephine was in the adjoining sitting room with his mother. Their voices drifted through the half-open door, an endless stream of chatter about table linens and seating arrangements. "We simply cannot put Lord Hemlock next to the Dowager," Josephine was saying, her voice bright and sharp as a silver bell. "He smells distinctly of hunting hounds, and she will complain about her asthma until the dessert course." "Quite right, my dear," his mother agreed. "We shall put him near the drafty window. That should encourage him to leave early." They laughed, a polite, tinkling sound. Gideon stared at his reflection in the tall cheval glass. He looked perfect, the Duke of Rothsay, wealthy, powerful, impeccably tailored. He also looked dead. His gray eyes were flat, the skin around them tight and bruised with exhaustion. He hadn't slept a full night since the Tuesday Constance laughed at him. He kept hearing it, in the quiet moments between meetings with his steward, in the dead of night. During Josephine's endless monologues, "You are terrified of me, and I, and care, and he still was." "Your Grace?" The tailor looked up, sensing the sudden rigidity in Gideon's frame. Gideon looked down at the man. Then he looked at his own hands. They were clean, spotless, useless. "Take it off," Gideon said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Hoarse. The tailor blinked, removing a pin from his mouth. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I just need to adjust the side seam." "Take the coat off," Gideon repeated, louder this time. The panic in his chest was suddenly overwhelming. He couldn't breathe. The air in the room was entirely devoid of oxygen. He didn't wait for the tailor. Gideon grabbed the lapels of the unfinished coat and tore it open. A pin scraped sharply against his ribs, drawing a thin line of blood. He didn't care. He shrugged out of the garment, letting the heavy, expensive wool drop to the floor. "Gideon?" His mother appeared in the doorway, her brow furrowed. Josephine stood behind her, looking confused. "What on earth are you doing? Mr. Vance is not finished." Gideon ripped the starch cravat from his neck, tossing it onto a velvet chair. He took a deep, jagged breath. The air still tasted of lilies. "I cannot do this," he said. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at Josephine. She looked back at him, her pretty face freezing into a mask of polite incomprehension. "Cannot do what, darling?" she asked, a nervous edge creeping into her voice. "The fitting?" "The wedding," Gideon said. The words tasted like ash and adrenaline. "I cannot marry you, Josephine." Silence dropped over the room like a heavy woolen blanket. The tailor froze, still kneeling on the floor. His mother's face turned the color of old parchment. "Gideon, stop this at once. You are having a nervous spell. The stress." "Gideon, it is not stress," Gideon said. He walked past them. He didn't offer an apology. He didn't offer an explanation. He couldn't. There was no polite way to explain that he was abandoning his duty because the thought of a life without a muddy-booted clerk made him want to walk into the estate lake. He left the dressing room. He left the manor. He saddled his own horse in the stables, ignoring the shocked stares of the grooms, and rode out the gates. He didn't have a plan. He just knew he had to get away from the smell of the flowers. It was raining in York. It had been raining for 2 days straight. The streets were rivers of brown sludge. Constance was walking home from the printer's shop, holding a piece of oiled canvas over her head. It did very little to stop the freezing rain from soaking her shoulders. Her boots were saturated, her toes numb. The hem of her wool skirt dragged heavily in the mud, slapping wetly against her ankles with every step. She reached the tavern and bypassed the main door, slipping into the dark, narrow alley that led to the rickety wooden stairs of her boarding house. She was exhausted. The lead type had been particularly stubborn today, and her fingers ached with a dull, throbbing pain. She climbed the stairs, the wet wood groaning under her weight. She reached the landing and fumbled in her damp pocket for her iron key. A shadow moved in the gloom by her door. Constance froze, her hand gripping the cold metal of the key. "Who's there?" she snapped, her voice hard. "In this part of the city, hesitation. Got your purse stolen. Or worse." The shadow stepped forward. The dim light from the street lamp below caught his face. Constance dropped her canvas. It fell to the wet boards with a soft slap. It was Gideon. He looked terrible. His hair, usually combed back with absolute precision, was plastered to his forehead by the rain. He wasn't wearing a greatcoat, only a dark riding jacket that was soaked through, the fabric clinging to his shoulders. His boots, the polished boots she had always despised, were caked in layers of gray city mud. He was shivering. Constance stared at him. Her brain refused to process the image. "What are you doing here?" Her tone was not soft. It was the crack of a whip. Gideon flinched, but he didn't look away. "I paid a private investigator to find you. It took him 2 weeks." "That doesn't answer my question," Constance said, crossing her arms over her wet chest, trying to suppress her own shiver. "Are you lost, Your Grace? The silk merchants are 3 streets over." He absorbed the insult. He deserved it. He looked down at her hands, taking in the bruised knuckles and the permanent gray shadow of the printer's grease. He reached out, slowly, as if approaching a feral animal, and gently took her right hand. Constance stiffened, but she didn't pull away. His skin was freezing. "I called off the wedding," Gideon said. His voice was a rasp, stripped of all its usual aristocratic polish. Constance felt a violent lurch in her stomach. She looked up at his face. His gray eyes weren't bored anymore. They were wide, frantic, and entirely focused on her. "Why?" she demanded, her voice shaking slightly. "Did Lady Josephine wear the wrong color ribbon? Did you find a smudge on her pedigree? Because of you." The words hung in the damp air. Constance laughed. It was a short, bitter sound. "Don't put this on me. You don't get to ruin your life and blame it on the clerk." "I am not blaming you," Gideon said, his grip on her hand tightening. "I am thanking you." She tried to yank her hand back, but he held fast. "Let me go, Gideon. You are wet, you are freezing, and you are being ridiculous. Go home." I don't have one, he said quietly. Not really. The scandal is broken. My mother has locked herself in the dower house. Half the peerage is demanding I be exiled to the continent. I have made an absolute, spectacular mess of my life. He stepped closer. The smell of the rain and wet wool mixed with the faint, lingering scent of bergamot. You called me a coward, he whispered, looking down at her. You were right. I was terrified of what the world would say. But, sitting in that house, looking at a future where I never saw you again, where I never heard you argue with me, where I never saw ink on your fingers. He swallowed hard. That terrified me more. Constance stared at him. She searched his face for the lie, for the temporary madness of an aristocrat slumming it for a thrill. But she only saw exhaustion and a desperate, raw honesty that stripped him bare. She looked at his chest, watching the rapid rise and fall of his breathing. Her anger, the hot, righteous fury that had kept her warm for 3 weeks, began to crack. I live in a closet above a tavern, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I smell like lampblack and cheap soap. I will never sit at a mahogany table with your mother. I hate mahogany, Gideon said. A small, self-deprecating smile touched the corner of his mouth. And my mother is currently plotting my murder anyway. Constance looked down at their joined hands, his pale, freezing skin against her rough, greased knuckles. It was a chaotic contrast. It was a disaster waiting to happen. I won't be your secret, Gideon, she warned, looking back up, her eyes fierce. I won't be a mistress hidden in a townhouse while you try to salvage your reputation. I don't want a mistress, he said, stepping into her space, uncaring of the wet canvas on the floor or the rain dripping from the eaves. I want my clerk. I want the woman who laughed in my face when I tried to buy her off. I want a wife who terrifies me. He brought his other hand up, cupping her cold, wet cheek. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. Constance closed her eyes. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion, and underneath that, a terrifying surge of hope. She opened her eyes and let out a long breath. You are going to ruin my good shoes with all that mud. Gideon let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. He was shivering violently now, the cold finally penetrating his ruined jacket. Let's go inside, Constance said quietly, turning the key in the lock. The door opened to the tiny, freezing room. It wasn't a castle. It wasn't a happily ever after, neatly tied with a silk ribbon. It was messy, cold, and uncertain. But as Gideon followed her into the dark, pulling the door shut behind them and blocking out the noise of the city, it was finally, brutally real. If you felt the sting of Constance's defiance and the heavy cost of Gideon's pride, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button if you prefer raw, messy romance over fairy tales. Share this video with someone who appreciates characters with real flaws and muddy boots. And make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, grounded historical dramas that strip away the polish and expose the beating heart beneath. Your support keeps these stories alive.